Good afternoon and good evening, everyone, and welcome to Laboring Towards Wholeness, a training on dismantling the patriarchy. My name is Benita Croyle, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a member of MCUSA Women in Leadership Steering Committee, and I am honored to moderate today's panel and so grateful for each of our panelists' time, wisdom, and willingness to share their expertise with all of us. I believe we have 155 people registered for today's hour to hour and a half event. And I invite you to take a moment to share in the chat your name and the name of the Indigenous land on which you live. So you can go ahead and put that there. I believe you'll have some options to send it to everyone or just to the panelists. As you do that, and before the panelists introduce themselves this evening, I want to begin tonight's panel by honoring and acknowledging this sacred virtual space, and by recognizing that even though we are meeting virtually, each one of us is on colonized Indigenous land, land that was stolen through genocide, slavery, and forced removal. We acknowledge and honor Indigenous communities as the original stewards of these ancestral lands, and we pay our respects to their elders, past and present. We also acknowledge the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together today, and the many murdered and missing Indigenous women. Let us recognize that remembering is a starting point and not an ending point. During tonight's discussions, panelists will discuss the Laboring Towards Wholeness curriculum development process and identified shared commitments. They will also share personal reflections about what they learned as they developed this curriculum, why developing an intersectional curriculum was important, and suggestions about implementation. And you might hear some new terms like patriarchy, sexualized violence, and intersectionality. In order to help develop a shared understanding, I will define these terms and also share the definitions in the chat. So I'm going to put those out here in a moment. The first vocabulary word is patriarchy, a social structure in which men hold power and domination over others, including women and non-human beings. And this definition is from the Indigenous Peoples Solidarity Movement, Ottawa. Sexualized violence is any violence, physical or psychological, carried out through sexual means or by targeting a person's sexuality. This includes rape, sexualized assault, acquaintance assault, or date rape, drug or alcohol facilitated sexual assault, manipulation and coercion, psychological violence, intimate partner violence, sexual harassment, exploitation, or anything that compromises a person's right to claim his or her sexuality without violence, violence against a person who does not conform to gender stereotypes. And the last one that I want to highlight for us tonight is intersectionality. Every person embodies multiple social locations: race, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, socioeconomic class, religion, ethnicity, culture, ability, size, etc. Intersectionality is how society empowers or disempowers people based on these multiple social locations. And this definition is from Roots of Justice that was adapted from Kimberly Crenshaw. At the end of tonight's panel, you will have opportunity to ask questions. And we know that some of you have already submitted questions for our panelists when you registered, so thank you. If you have questions that arise for you tonight as our panelists present, please send the questions to me, Benita Croyle, via the chat button, which is located at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to answer as many questions as we can. And a reminder that tonight's webinar is for those wanting to do the deep intersectional work of naming and dismantling patriarchy, and are seeking additional tools to do this. It is not intended for people who need to be convinced that the patriarchy is problematic. So please keep in mind that with your questions. We also recognize that some of tonight's topics might be sensitive or triggering, and we understand if you need to log off or leave the webinar in order to do whatever self-care you deem appropriate. Please know that this webinar will be recorded and available after tonight, and we are so glad to hold space with each one of you tonight. So after that bit of a lengthy introduction, friends, would you mind introducing yourself with your name, location, and your reason or motivation for being on the writing team? And Linda, would you mind starting us off tonight?
Sure. I'm Linda Gaiman-Peachy from Lancaster City, Pennsylvania. And I was eager to work on this, this curriculum because of my own lived experience as a woman in a church where women were not treated as equal partners and were not allowed to function as leaders in the church. And so I was very eager to participate in creating something that would hopefully help us as a church deal with those past patterns or current patterns of patriarchy and sexism.
Thank you, Linda. Jenny, Regina, Erica, Chantel, and Lorraine. Would you mind introducing yourself tonight?
Hi, I'm Jenny Castro. You know, we embarked on this journey together in 2015, and at the time it was part of my work. And so that was my impetus, and it's my passion. It's a piece of my life journey.
I'm Regina. I currently live in Goshen, Indiana. I'm originally from Cleveland, Ohio. And like Jenny, I was involved in this because it's the content are questions that I have wrestled with for myself, for my own vocation, for my own family system, certainly as part of the work that I do as a person who teaches within the context of patriarchy, teaches about patriarchy and other systems of oppression. It is a place where there's lots that I want to explore and know from my own stories and from other people's stories, and doing collective work towards an end that empowers all of us.
Welcome, Pivagay of One Hot Naheshbin Natistas. My name is Erica Littlewolf. I am from the Northern Cheyenne Reservation in southeastern Montana, a small portion of my original homelands, and I am super happy to be here and pumped, and I'm not caffeinated, and so I'm just naturally just pumped. I use she, her, hers pronouns. And I think technically I was invited to be a part of the writing team. So that's like the technical aspect. But personally, I was frustrated by only having the conversation on race. But as a woman of color, it wasn't the whole conversation for me. And so just being frustrated by the sexism I was experiencing also, and not being able to have the entire conversation. And so only being able to have one side of the conversation, but for me, not the whole conversation, and wanting that analysis piece so that I could have the conversation with others, because otherwise, if it just sat within me, it was like, oh my gosh, am I the one losing it? Yeah, so that I think is my personal motivation for being a part of the writing team.
I'm not sure if I'm next. but I'm gonna go next anyways. Hi y'all, Chantal Todman, she, they pronouns, living here in Philadelphia. Yeah, when we talked about dreaming together as a group about, you know, the need for some kind of analysis, as Erica said, about like where is the conversation happening around patriarchy and the ways it's just shaping all of our lives, and just feeling like really we needed to have that conversation. We needed to have the analysis to have that conversation. And so once we decided to write the curriculum, I was really excited to be part of that because there was so much I wanted to say. There was so much I wanted there to be out there in the world for my children to be able to point to, that this mattered, that we were actually trying to address and dismantle this structure of oppression. So yeah, grateful to be part of this amazing group of writers.
The nice thing about watching you all go is that I know it's my turn. So I'm Lorraine Stutzman-Amstutz. I'm currently living in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and just want to acknowledge that it's the ancestral lands of a number of indigenous tribes, including the Susquehannocks, who are best known in Lancaster County by Conestogas, Nanticokes, Delaware, Lenape. So want to acknowledge that and pay respect to the elders past and present. I think when Jenny said it was 2015, it makes it seem like so long ago that we actually started that. And so, which also is a good reason why I probably don't fully remember how I came to it. Although I know how excited I was to be part of this, because I think it was something that some of us had obviously thought about and talked about, and yeah, because it's part of our lives and for me, it was part of my work at Mennonite Central Committee in restorative justice. And so I was just so very excited and honored to be part of working at this with all of you, and knowing the words that we were also bringing from others who maybe not been part of this, but who we carried with us. And so I'm so appreciative and so loved being part of that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for introducing yourself and for being with us tonight. I am just so grateful sitting in your presence as we are diving into this. And there are some comments in the chat that are also just really encouraging you tonight. So tonight's agenda, we're going to start off with Jenny kind of going over the process that was used to create and develop this curriculum. Then we're going to transition into Chantal. I'll screen share at that time so we can take a look at the table of contents, and Chantal will kind of go over the shared commitments. And then we're going to open it up into some group questions for the panelists before we do audience question and answer. So with that being said, Jenny, go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, so these last few days, I've been spending time thinking about how this all came to be. And in the summer of 2015, the steering committee of what was then called the Women in Leadership Project met in person for the first time in Sarasota, Florida, to discern the next steps in our collective work within Mennonite Church USA. I'd been in my role as coordinator of this project for less than a year. And after the first Women Doing Theology conference organized by Women in Leadership the previous year, we understood that it was important to build on the momentum of the movement of women across MCUSA. As I tell the story of the curriculum, it's important to note a couple of important things that were true for women in leadership at that time. The steering committee, the group of women that envisioned and advised the work of women in leadership, was comprised of a majority of women of color, Black, Brown, Indigenous, Asian women. This was an intentional decision by Joanna Schenk, who was the previous coordinator in the role that I held, that she, as an ethnic Mennonite woman, would be guided in her work by women of color. And two, the other significant thing is that in the fall of 2014, I a Mexican American woman, was invited to take responsibility of shepherding the work of women in leadership into the next phase. You see, I believe that who is in the room matters. In our work with women in leadership, the collective wisdom rooted in the lived experience of this particular group of women profoundly impacted the unfolding work of women in leadership going forward with this curriculum, as well as the other work we did with the Women Doing Theology conferences, with the Holding It Together podcast. Over the course of our discussions that weekend in Sarasota, a few things became really clear. We knew from our own experience, as well as the stories of our sisters and siblings across the church, that as in many mainline Christian denominations, sexism rooted in patriarchy continues to impede the flourishing of the leadership of almost any person who wasn't a white man. And that was evident both anecdotally and statistically. And we were uniquely situated to produce work that had the potential to impact the culture and practice of MCUSA congregations and institutions with regard to patriarchy. So we decided that we must. It felt important for women and others whose contributions to our faith and theology were being systematically sidelined and ignored and devalued. And it felt important for who we say we are as Mennonites, as people whose faith compels us to actively engage in the work of justice. So the following year, the summer of 2016, a group of women, these women, who would become the writers of the curriculum, gathered in Akron, Pennsylvania, to imagine together what was possible. That weekend, we collaborated to outline what would become Laboring Toward Wholeness. Our process was a bit messy and loud, and it was energizing and collaborative and strategic. We spent significant time defining, coming to agreement on many of the terms you'll find in the curriculum. I remember talking about it being important as writers to be speaking the same language, to be on the same page with the words we were using. And we came to an agreement on format and structure and assigned sections and set deadlines. And then for the next 2 years, we wrote and worked and edited, and we met and we tweaked and we edited and we wrote. And in the spring of 2018, when we had a solid draft of the curriculum, we tested it with a group of collaborative participants who agreed to engage and offer feedback on the workshop. We got feedback, and we learned a lot about the importance of creating clear agreements and the hard work of holding one another and participants accountable to those agreements. That fall in 2018, we met one last time as curriculum writers to edit and finalize this labor. We'd planned to release it at a Train the Trainer event in 2019. But my departure from MCUSA staff delayed that launch. And it was rescheduled for 2020, but then COVID. And so we find ourselves here this week, after years of planning and delays. Laboring Toward Wholeness enters the world. Thank you for your interest and your support and for joining us on this call. But I'm not quite done. Over the course of creating Laboring Toward Wholeness, a couple of things crystallized for us as writers, and I think that they are important to name here. First, it's important to name and rename intersectionality. It is a lived reality for many of us on this team. Intersectionality is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it describes how society empowers or disempowers people based on multiple social locations or identities they hold. It's important to understand that for many of us, in the situations we encounter, it's impossible to sift out the isms. And too often, in the systems in which white men assume the power to set the norms, isms are pitted against each other. Folks whose bodies hold within them multiple intersecting identities are forced to identify as one thing. We as writers hold multiple identities and social locations, and it's important for us to be seen as whole people created in the image of God. We don't want folks to be forced to compartmentalize themselves. Like, now I'm showing up as a woman, or now I'm showing up as a Latina, because that's not how I experience reality. Second, through this curriculum, we're not advocating for power or influence in the church per se, like, give me what you have. That's not what we're talking about. This curriculum does not seek to compete or to prove anything to anyone or convince anyone of anything. Its intent is a bit more nuanced, and I believe the nuance is important to highlight. This curriculum reveals that when we are all at the table, when the insight, wisdom, the lived experience of historically marginalized folks are valued, when they are explored, when they are studied and integrated into our collective faith and theology, our understanding of God, of one another, of the world explodes. It is deeper and richer and more powerful and more profound. 3, at its essence, this curriculum recognizes the inherent sacredness of all people and seeks to amplify the voices of those who've been too long silenced and ignored. We explore frameworks for new ways of being and different systems from the ones we've inherited. We invite imagination and creativity with all who seek to engage this work together with us, recognizing the sacredness of every single one of us. As the psalmist writes in Psalm 139, you created each one of us. You created my inmost being and stitched me together in my mother's womb. For all these mysteries, I thank you for the wonder of myself. Through this work, we seek to honor and amplify the divine, the holy within each one of us, and to allow that sacred inspiration to influence our collective faith journey.
Thank you, Jenny. I am deeply, deeply grateful for what you have named and what this team has brought. Chantel, I think what I'm going to do for your section is I'm just going to share out in the chat with all of the attendees the table of contents, because I think my screen might be too small for them to see it if I try to screen share. So I'm going to share that as you chat. But if you want to go ahead and talk a little bit about the table of contents and the shared commitment.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you clarifying that. Man, Jenny, you just really reminded me of like all the feelings and fire of like why we wanted to do this. Like you brought me right back there. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your passion and your conviction, right? Such compelling conviction. And I want you to know that like that passion and conviction is what carried us for 2 years, okay, doing this process. Otherwise we would not have made it. But yeah, as Jenny already shared, like we really were churning, thinking about how do we really tackle such a complex, long-standing structure, one that is in some ways invisibilized as the norms, right? Especially within the church, especially within American church, especially within this country, as something benign, right? Something truly non-problematic. And how do we really uncover the insidious and violent nature of patriarchy as a system and how it really harmed us? And so in developing the curriculum, we really wanted to take you on a journey. And starting from establishing norms and ways of being together. So I'm going to talk about that real quick. We really understood that the way we do the work matters, especially in our test run. We really realized like, okay, wait, we have to provide containers because we're all coming in the room from such different places, and we're carrying a lot of story in our body. And when we say things, we're not always on the same page. And so we really wanted to ground this training in some shared commitments that we were also reflecting back to each other. So here are some of the shared commitments that we grounded our work in, but also want to invite you to hold as you grapple with or facilitate teaching this curriculum. First was centering the margins, right? We create and hold space at the center of our shared experience for those whose voices have been historically on the margins of every level of our society. Kind of what Jenny said, we really want to make sure that whoever's been pushed, so they're not there on the margins by accident, right? They're pushed there intentionally. How do we recenter them? We wanted to really invite people to get comfortable with discomfort, because so much of this work activates things in us that we may not be ready to talk about or hadn't considered, or feelings of guilt or shame. And we've noticed that a lot in this work around systems. People want to run away from discomfort. And so we really wanted people to normalize the idea of this is going to be uncomfortable, and that's part of doing the work. The other commitment we grounded our work in, and invite you to ground this work in, is naming hard things. Sometimes people call it having brave conversations or courageous conversations. But recognizing that we're not going to always get this right. As Jenny said, this work is so messy, we'll make mistakes. But if we can enter into the space with an expectation that we're going to have to wrestle, but that we're also going to keep coming back to the conversation because this work is important, and that we will speak the truth to each other, grounded from a place in love. And the last commitment we had was practicing grace in space. So we're going to really intend and commit to extending grace to each other. We're going to honor each other's boundaries. Sometimes knowing that the most loving thing that we can do at certain points is to create more space between us, because we need a little, what's the quote? Which, you know what? Prentice, am I saying that name right? Prentice Hill? I feel like I'm saying their name wrong, but they're actually the person who coined this phrase, which says, boundaries is the distance between where I can love you and love myself. And so I want to make sure I give honor to the person who came up with that. But essentially practicing that, how do we really give space so that I can honor your autonomy and agency and sovereignty, but that we can still be in loving relationship with each other, knowing that some of this stuff means we have to take a break and come back together. So those are our commitments that we wrestled and came to, but also really want you to hold as you're teaching this curriculum. From there on, we talk about establishing shared understandings. We need common language so that when we both say patriarchy, we know what we're talking about. Talking about the historical patriarchy in history, the historical lens of how patriarchy has shaped where we are today. That is not something that we invented 2 years ago when we sat down and talked about this. It has a long legacy. How do we unpack that and understand it? That patriarchy is very much with us today. Patriarchy is alive and well. That it's not something that, because we have women, you ever notice that when people are like, oh, Black people don't have troubles, we have Oprah or Obama. And they say for women, y'all got no troubles, y'all got Oprah. We got the same person. If you're a Black woman, you get Oprah. to name anything that's better now. So anyways, they point to women, right? Now we got Kamala. So everything's better, right? But no, patriarchy is still alive and well. It's still impacting all of us. And not just people gendered as women or femmes. The way patriarchy is, it's reaching everybody. So we talk about that. Like if you're gendered and you live your life sexualized as a man or gender expansive, there's people slamming doors now. The patriarchy is impacting you too. We grappled with the Bible as a patriarchal text. We did it. We said we're going to do it. You know, got a little tricky, but how do you grapple with the patriarchal text? Well, we did it. Okay. And you can go experience it for yourself and see if you come out unscathed. And then we talked about what can you do? You have a place in dismantling patriarchy. How do you understand what your responsibility is and to whom are you accountable to in that work? God calls us to act, that the invitation of the divine is for us to be co-builders into a new world. So there is something beyond patriarchy, y'all. We invented, not we, because I had nothing to do with that, but some humans invented patriarchy. So we can invent something else, right? We could do this with the partnership of the spirit and of the divine. How is God calling us into something new, a new way of being beloved community? And lastly, or second to last, we close up the curriculum. We give you some ideas about how to make commitments for next steps and some resources. So that's just an overview of the curriculum. Like it's pretty dense, I feel like, but at the same time, I feel like it's really not so heavy that you can't navigate it. So we try to be as comprehensive as possible, but as friendly to people who coming from different points in the conversation as we could. So where you at in this journey is important, but it should not be a barrier for you engaging this curriculum. So that's my piece about the content of the curriculum.
Thank you, Chantel. Amen, amen. And I'm seeing some amens in the chat as well. As we transition into the next questions, we're going to move to panel questions. And I have 4 questions prepared tonight for the panel before we open it up for audience questions. Each panelist will have about 3 to 5 minutes to respond to each of the questions. And today's first question, we're going to start with Regina. Regina, I can imagine that developing this curriculum was exhausting, sobering, powerful, and rewarding. Can you share with us 1 or 2 things that you learned while writing this curriculum and participating in its implementation? And then if 2 other panelists want to tag team off of Regina, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. And just thanks for the ground, Jenny and Chantel, that you laid for this conversation. The 2 things that I will talk about in that, you know, what did it feel like? What am I remembering the most? What is my body sensory memory of the times? 2 things lifted up for me. 1, the joy and the hard work of collaboration, right? We, as has been said, as a writing team, and then broader than that, as Women in Leadership Steering Committee and staff, come from so many different places and stories and experiences. And while we did carry that commitment to honor all of that, it gets messy when you are trying to do a thing, right? It gets messy because of that. It gets messy because of life. We all had different responsibilities outside of this work, things that we had committed ourselves to, people that we were accountable to. And so I don't say that to say only that life is complicated, y'all, right? But how do you do this kind of work with that kind of context and say, and have the values that we hold in this curriculum live in the birthing of the curriculum, right? And so the hard work of collaboration meant that for me, and I think for the rest of the team, we were constantly reminding ourselves of what is it that we want to do, and how does that live even in the way that we are doing the work, right? And the second thing that I'll say is connected to that, and it's the accountability. How did I hold myself accountable to this community? How did I show up? How did they let me show up when I needed to show up in a way that was not like the best, right? And the trust that comes from that. And so I'm highlighting the positive aspects of that, but I'm grounding it in that's hard work. And what I valued so much about this process was the way that I saw my siblings doing this work with me, really committed to being real with each other, because there's a way that you can do collaboration and accountability that's like, let me put this veneer on so I can, do the thing. I just appreciated the realness, and I think that infused the work that we did. This the power that is in that realness of being able to be real. Like, maybe you don't get me all the way, but you get me enough to sit with me, and let me work this out. Let me wrestle this out. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Regina. I'm going to read the question again in case 2 or 3 other panelists want to respond to it. The question is this: can you share 1 or 2 things that you learned while writing this curriculum and participating in its implementation?
I can go ahead and share. I think one of the things I remember when we were first beginning and we were thinking about definitions and how actually, it was hard to define these things. And so we looked to other resources to define it and some of the terms that we use. And I think especially as an Indigenous woman, a woman of color, I could very much have a story or a scenario that happened, but I wasn't sure what to name it. And so we all had the stories, and the stories all carried the intersections, but they're so layered and intertwined that we were like, what word do we use for that? And so I think that's one thing that sticks out for me, that as patterned as these are, as patterned as patriarchy is, as patterned as sexism can be, as patterned as racism can be, they're still very elusive. And I think that came out in trying to come up with definitions that fit, like that aren't so broad that everything can fit in, but then aren't so tight that you can't get other things in. And I think that sticks with me the most. And then I think what is exhausting about it is you can't help but bring your own stories or your own memories. And as you're coming up with this curriculum, like looking back over your life and then realizing like, oh, gross, that's what happened. Like maybe at the time you didn't realize this situation was sexism or this was patriarchal. And then as you start digging further into things and then you look back and you're like, oh, sick, like it was. And then just feeling like, since it came up, like I gotta kind of deal with this, and I think, yeah, some of that came up. And then just feeling, I think especially for me, the things that came up for me was very personally, like just the not having kids, that within the church and not being married within the church were things that were very present when you deal with sexism and patriarchy within the church. Because I feel like that's what the church expects of you as a woman. And so for me, it's like every time I looked at this curriculum, I'm like, oh my gosh, like I really don't fit in. You know, you think you don't fit in, and then you start tearing something apart and you're like, oh, okay, I don't fit in. And so yeah, I think some of that is what is exhausting, but then it can also be empowering, because then it just invalidates you, like, I don't fit in, you know. Yeah, so I think that's some of the things that I think about. But yeah, and I think also the other thing is, I remember when we started, we did, I think, a basic Google search on like anti-patriarchy, anti-sexism curriculum. There is none. And so I think when we were like, what? Like, you know, because there's some anti-racism stuff out there, you know, and we were just like, you gotta be kidding me. Because I think maybe our thought process was like, oh, we'll just church it up, you know, like if there's something out there, we'll like put some Bible verses in, you know, and optional Bible verses for the extra churchy churches and all that kind of stuff. And it don't exist. And so then we were calling people we know, and no, it really don't exist. So then we really just had to start with nothing. And so I think that was also exhausting too, is just like knowing what to put in, like what's relevant, what's not relevant, when your denomination is all over the place. Yeah, so those are some of the things that come to mind for me.
Thank you, Erica. Does anyone else want to respond before we move on to the next question? I'll give you a couple seconds.
Yeah, I could say a little bit, Bonita. Yeah, I just want to say it was such an honor to be part of this group. And I think I learned so much. And one of the things we've referred to a lot, and that Jenny really highlighted, was the concept of intersectionality. And as a white woman, that was something that maybe was newer to me. And so it was important for me to really try to understand and have learned to really value the perspectives that have come through that lens. I would say the other thing that was really challenging as a white woman is, especially when we did the testing and started the implementation process, to learn what my role is as a white woman, especially in the accountability of other white women, and sort of how and also as a Mennonite older Mennonite woman, to learn how to be more comfortable with discomfort. And so those were all things that were real learning. I'm still learning how to how to do all those things better. I did want to say a little bit more about the collaboration, and that was just something that was so valuable, not only in sort of how we came together and designed it, but then we divided up as teams. I mean, each of the sections, there were at least 2 of us working on it together. So none of it was written by one person. It was all very collaborative, and it was such a rich way to do things. One didn't have to be an expert all by yourself. We could learn from and work with another person. And then of course we all saw it and could react to it. So those were some of the things that I learned in the process.
Thank you, Linda. I'm going to move on to the second question, but panelists, if there's ever a question that I'm moving on and you want to just interject, or we'll circle back to it. The second question that I'll ask, and we'll start with Erica for this one, is when dismantling systems of oppression, Activists often call for an intersectional approach, and Jenny spoke a little bit about this, and Chantel, actually, most of you have mentioned a little bit of it, but I want to dive in a little further. In particular, approaches that center the voices of Indigenous and Black and Brown women. Can you share with us a few reasons why intersectionality and centering the experiences of women at the borders and margins of US society is so important? And specifically how that centering impacted the development of this curriculum?
I think what comes to mind is, from anti-racism is whiteness wants to take things apart, like one thing at a time. So whiteness wants to solve racism. And then when that's solved, then we'll get to sexism. And then we'll get to this, and then this, and this. And for people of color, like, we can't do that. And so I think intersectionality is the reality that people of color live with. We can't dissect ourselves like that. That is nowhere near our reality. And so by using an intersectional approach, we put in the center the stories that have been marginalized out. And sometimes I think of, like, I don't know, I think about the gravel road, like a gravel road. If you ever driven on a gravel road, it's like the gravel tends to like fade out, right? And so it's like people of color are like the gravel way out, but then a plow comes along and reheaps it back up. And so it's like we reheap the gravel back up, and it's like the people of color are like actually on the road now, right? And so I think it was very important to do that. And it's also hard to do because it's not the norm. And I would say personally, in the implementation stage of it, it got very hot and sweaty to be centered, like in the delivery and the implementation of it. I distinctly just remember, like, I think I was co-presenting with Chantel, and I don't even know what we were presenting. And I just remember being very thankful for my deodorant, because I was getting super like, woo, this is like uncomfortable, because I did not realize I would be seen in ways that I hadn't been seen. Like, for one, I'm presenting, but then I'm uncovering both sexism and racism to a group of people. And so I was used to talking about racism all the time, but now it's like that intersection, right? That thing that makes murdered or missing Indigenous women happen. And so it felt like I was almost uncovering my safety net, that like, I almost cussed. Like, oh, dang, like if I bring this to light, does it make me unsafe? Or if I bring this to light, does it help? And so I remember that moment very clearly, and just kind of feeling exposed. And I wasn't ready for that. Like I didn't expect that feeling to happen. And so I think there's very much like this approach in our head that like, we know we should do this intersectionality, and we were very intent on doing that. But I think my body had a different response, like I because it doesn't happen, and so I think when it does, it's definitely a full body response. But yeah, and I think when people use this curriculum to be aware of that, particularly for women of color, I think when you're training or if you're leading, be aware that it will affect you differently as a presenter, or even being in the space, hearing some of the stuff that is presented. It very much takes hold in your body.
Thank you, Erica, for sharing so vulnerably. I want to check in and see if there's maybe one or two other people that want to respond to that question. If not, we can move on. But the question again is this: Can you share with us a few reasons why intersectionality and centering the experiences of women at the borders, margins of US society is so important, and specifically how that centering impacted the development of this curriculum?
Lorraine, you go and then I'll say something after you.
Okay. So I just think about that term was so critical for, I think, us in our conversations and then in the implementation. And I think for me that term intersectionality just provides such the language to talk about kind of the limitations of the single issue discussions that we tend to have. And so for me, that was just so helpful. And I think it allows us to look at power based on those multiple social locations that we talk about and that we know exist, but it's just so easy to silo them. So to be able to have, I think that term to help guide us, I think was so important. So I think we talked about it because we knew it mattered and it was so significant. And I also thought, yeah, we found ourselves bumping up against it throughout that implementation piece. And I think for me, partly, and particularly as a white woman, I think I felt conflict bumping up against it, because I felt like, oh, but it's about patriarchy, but no, it's also about racism. And we're talking and using that intersectionality in all that we do. And so we have to be so mindful of that. And I think there were times for me where I just found that really difficult. And just as you talked about that difficulty for you, Erica, I think that awareness that I think we each need to have as we're in that implementation was just so critical. And I think that recognition for me that, yes, if we did it again, it would look very different because I feel like we learned so much through that about intersectionality, even though we've been talking so much about it and you have that kind of conceptual understanding of it, but boom, there it is. And there we all were kind of in that sweaty hot mess of it. So that was just a really, I think, a learning space for me and something, that awareness that I think we need to constantly be aware and understand as we go into this.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to oh man, this is making me remember the magic of writing something with these humans. But how could we, when you're addressing a system of domination that has profited off of, femme bodies, constructs of domination and control over those deemed to be weaker, less than, and disposable, how could we not tell the stories that don't get told? Because that's kind of the silencing of patriarchy is what keeps us participating in it, right? The normalization, the silence, the ways that you get blamed if you name it as being the problem meant that we had to really expose the ways, we had to really kind of shame, we had to shame patriarchy. No, we had to expose patriarchy for the monster that it is, right? Because I say that I think it seems to be so benign or so normalized that I think intersectionality really shines a spotlight and really says, no, this is why it's problematic. And also, how could I, as a Black femme, how could I write myself out of the curriculum? Do you know what I'm saying? If I didn't write an intersectional curriculum, I would not be in there. And we've had too many movements that are supposed to be for the liberation of all people that fell short because certain people were written out of the curriculum or out of the new world. And I can't write myself out of the new world. Yeah, I got to be there in the new world. So to not be intersectional meant I was not going to be speaking to anybody like me. And that would have been a waste of, frankly, my time and my energy. So it felt like to center myself and to center others who live the realities of how patriarchy tries to fragment us was not even a question. So yeah, that's what I say about that.
Thank you.
If I could just add one.
Oh yeah, Regina.
real quick, because it's what you all have said is gold. And the thing that I would also hook onto this is, as we remember the ways that systems of oppression marginalize and harm and invisibilize people, we also need to name and name and name again that the reason that they persist is because they also benefit people. And that's why they're so hard to, that's why it wants to be invisibilized, because, and so naming that there are people who benefit from these systems in these ways is important. And it reminds me of the vulnerability that Erica named so well, because when you start naming that, when you start saying, when you essentially are saying, and yeah, some of y'all like it because because it works for you, and then people get mad at, not at patriarchy and systems of oppression, but the people who are exposing it. And that doesn't feel great, but it's part of the, like, it's part of the work.
Yes, yes. And I want to take a moment and just identify that each of you took risk writing this curriculum. Part of what you said, Regina, is people aren't going to like it. And I deeply, it's hard for me to, I'm deeply grateful. I'm deeply, deeply grateful for this work. I'm going to transition into my next question. And we'll start with Lorraine for this one. So Lorraine, I understand that each of you participated in writing various sections of the curriculum, and I'm curious if you might have one or two things that you want to highlight about a section that stood out to you. And then if anyone else wants to join in after that, I will repeat the question. But Lorraine, let's go ahead and start with you.
So one of the things I think, as writers kind of joke about is remembering which sections we did write. And so fortunately we have it documented, but part of it is I think we also read each other's sections and apparently think we may have written some of those other sections. I don't know, but so there was kind of that confusion among us, and maybe that's a good thing. So no need to apologize to each other because we all kind of forget. But one of the sections that I thought about when I saw this question was that Chantal and I working on the establishing norms and ways of being. And I think part of that was maybe fun. I enjoyed that section, and some of it with Chantal was because we had just come off of an experience of working together where we led an event for a week. And so we paid particular attention to some of those ways of being. And I remember as we were talking about this, that, you know, we weren't just setting the tone that for what the training was going to be and what our time was going to be, which we felt like was so critical and so important that we knew we needed to do that, but also that we were creating something to fall back on when things didn't go well. And that was equally as significant for us. And we needed to, we did, I mean, in the implementation of it. But we did talk about creating, and Chantal mentioned this earlier, a courageous space that allowed people to speak their truth. But we also wanted to do that with a commitment not to harm one another, but also to speak to power, that we knew just the power dynamics that were in the room and how we also had to pay attention to that. So, you know, while I felt like we specifically wanted to have a commitment to this values-based approach, there's also that need to recognize that sometimes values can be interpreted differently. And so what, you know, all of that I felt like happened, and all of that we tried to pay attention to in what seemed like a fairly, okay, let's just establish some norms and ways of being together and creating community. But that it was, it felt like it was a lot of intention and a lot of care that you have, that's important, that how we establish that and how we invite people into that space is important. Not only is it providing, I think, a different way of knowing than maybe what we're used to and kind of more partly whether white-centered patriarchal methods of learning. So I felt like we were trying to create all of that in just that section. So that one for me, I think felt very significant and important.
Thank you, Lorraine. I'm going to just read the end of that question again for our panelists. Tell me one or two things that you would like to highlight about the sections that feel important to you. Panelists, I also want to just note we have been receiving some live questions which we'll answer later, but I'm going to put them in the chat for you to check out ahead of time. All right, so we will move on to the next question if there's no other responses for that one. The last question that I have prepared is this, and we'll start with Jenny. Jenny, one of my favorite spiritual practices is the practice of freedom dreaming, the practice of dreaming of and working towards realities that center life affirming and life sustaining practices that are outside of incarceral systems. As you think about this curriculum, I'm curious about your freedom dreams. What are 2 or 3 hopes or dreams you have for this curriculum? And what, if you feel comfortable sharing, are 1 or 2 fears?
I think when I think about I shared at the beginning that like this, my what compelled me to be part of this project was that it felt like it's my life's work. It felt like it was just an important part of my life's journey, right? Like that it was one of the important milestones in what I was doing in my life. And I often, when I talk about my journey from childhood to adolescence to adulthood, the image that comes to mind when I see that, like see myself growing and developing, you know, I see myself as a young woman, an adolescent woman, but just so burdened that I am bent over with the burden that I carry. And when I think about the work that I had to do over the course of my adulthood to throw off the burdens that had been put upon me, so getting to the dreams is what I dream of, people like my children standing straight and tall and never being burdened in the way that I was. And creating new ways of being, new ways of doing faith, new ways of doing life that celebrate their divinity, that celebrate who they uniquely are. And like the image that I just see is like young people standing tall and proud.
Thank you, Jenny. want to open it up for the rest of our panelists to respond, because I think it's an important question. If you don't have a response, that's fine. But if there are 2 or 3 other people that want to respond about freedom dreaming for this curriculum, or if you feel comfortable to share, maybe you have dreams and you have fears. So I want to take some time to give you space to respond to that.
I can say a couple of words about the dream, and particularly in these past few years where it has felt like, at least in, well, I'm going to say in the US context, but we could globalize it, that these dreams of freedom seem to be farther and farther out of our reach. But I want to be a person that continues to have that dream. And so more than ever, I need to know that there is a community of people that continues to believe with me that we can do better. We can rebuild systems. And in thinking about that, I'm just reminded about the statement from, if people are familiar with the Combahee River Collective group of Black feminists in the 1970s that put together this document that says a lot of the things that we're still saying in 2021. And one of the sentences in that was, if Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free. And we can say that for any marginalized group. If these people get free, then that means like it's a ripple effect for all of us. And so my dream in that is that we can help each other understand that it's not a zero-sum game, that there is enough. And that's the part of my faith that I hold on to. Like, there is enough. If we distribute it equitably, there is enough. And there's too many of us that don't believe, that have been taught not to believe that.
Thank you, Regina. Is there anyone else that wants to respond to this question before we move into question and answer? Linda.
Yes, thank you both, Jenny and Regina. You expressed so well what are, well, my dreams as well. I think, yeah, as I thought about the question, I think the image that came to me is like a community that's more whole and that really can receive the wisdom and the gifts of everyone. I mean, because I think we've lost so much by restricting who can speak and who can be heard, who can contribute, and we've lost so much. And so how can we build a community that's more whole? The other thing I'll venture to say is actually, I think my fears are longer than my dreams. And I'll just say, I think one of my fears is, I'll just put this out there, that maybe groups will treat this as sort of an interesting academic exercise and, oh, well, let's talk about this, and not really be willing to do the work of looking at their own behaviors and patterns within the group, and maybe really not being willing to listen to those who haven't been heard. I think it's just so easy for people who've been used to being in the center to sort of take over the discussion, and they like hearing themselves talk. And so I think, I guess my hope is that as people engage with this, they really take the time and put the effort in to make sure that everyone is heard, and especially those who traditionally haven't been. So yeah, that's both a hope and a fear, I guess. And I would say it's not an intellectual, I mean, it is that we have to understand, we have to better understand, but there's so much more here that we have to do if we want this to make a difference.
Thank you, Linda. Panelists, as we transition into our question and answer time, is there any thoughts or questions that you want to add before we do so? Okay, wonderful. So at this time, we want to open it up for audience questions. A gentle reminder again that we really appreciate respectful questions. And if you have one, please send it to me, Benita Croyle, via the chat button on your screen that's located at the bottom. While you're thinking of your questions, I will have the panelists respond to some of the submitted questions. The first one that was submitted is this: when we dismantle patriarchy, will we have matriarchy or some other archy? What will this look like? And I believe many of you answered that with your freedom dreaming, but I really want to open it up if you have any additional thoughts to respond to that one.
I think the cool part is possibly that we don't know. And I think it becomes then who are we with when we create something new? And so then it becomes process oriented, that the process becomes more important than the product, that these ways of being together that are in this curriculum become ways that we create. Because when we remove these oppressive ways that clog our creativity, that our creativity come to the forefront and we can create something new or something new old or something old new. So I don't think there's a set way. And I think that's the best thing, right? Like, who wants to live? Well, maybe some people do. But I don't want to live a life that's like, oh, I undo this and then I want to get there, like a prescribed, like a prescription based. And I think that's possibly the point to undoing oppression, is we don't know. And that's the best thing. Like, that's where your faith comes in, and that's where your imagination and your creativity and all these things, and that you trust that there's this abundance of all of that because you have the right people with you, and it takes relational skills and ways of being together. And that's exciting. And that's where I want to be. I'm not so concerned with where I end up. I'm just concerned with who I'm with and how we're doing it. So I know the elders always used to tell us, do it in a good way. And I always used to be like, I don't know what that means. But now I get it. It's a process way. Like, make sure your process is good. And I think that's, to me, that's what matters. Not so much that we're orienting ourselves to this finished product that, like, now this is the way that everyone must do it, because each community is different, and maybe they'll do it, find a new way of being, and find out later that, hey, we need to change this again, and then they'll find another way of being. So that's my like 2 cents, but because of inflation, it's probably like 25 cents.
Thank you, Erica.
Like a whole dollar, Erica. So I think you're cutting yourself short. That was definitely a solid $1 worth of wisdom. So not that we need to monetize things, but that's it. That was my response. That's the wisdom I had to give you. I was putting some oil on Erica. That was good. That was
awesome. I'm going to move into the second question, and if anyone has thoughts that are resonating, we can circle back to those as well.
Well, can I just say one more thing before we go
Absolutely,
on to
Jenny.
the question is that, like, I think the assumption in that question is that, like, somebody has to be on top. There has to be a winner. There has to be a person who, or a, oh, sorry, that's my, sorry. there has to be a group or a ruler or whatever. And I think that is like, I think what I was trying to say at the beginning, we're not trying to get your spot or take power from you. It's about imagining something new. So what I keep thinking about in this conversation and reflecting on the process of creating this curriculum was that, like, this whole process, this collaboration, this creation of this thing was messy, and it was hard, and it took so much time and investment. And I think about, like, I mean, the work. And I just keep thinking of it as a metaphor for, like, this this new thing, like this new way, like that the actual labor of doing this curriculum, in that we were leaning into this new thing. And I think, I wouldn't have thought of that when we were doing it, but, like, how beautiful that is, and how grateful I am to have been a part of something so magical.
Thank you, Jenny. The second question that we received is this. Last August, I was in a congregational meeting and some stuff was hitting some fans, and I called out the spirit of patriarchy in an attempt to bind it. But that loosed some other stuff. 9 months later, we've had some conversations about patriarchy, and folks read some bell hooks, The Will to Change, and things are raw, numb, and going underground. Would you recommend trying this curriculum with a group that's not weathered these other conversations as well?
I mean, listen. Yes. Why? Because we have nothing left to lose but our chains. Okay, so it didn't go well, but you're all still here, right? Or maybe you're not all. So hopefully nobody was bodily harmed. But, like, I think, like, there are parameters in this curriculum, but there's no promise of perfection, or there's not a promise that things won't be messy or hard or difficult, or you won't have to, right? Grace and space. Like, you took that moment, maybe you had to have some space, but come back to the conversation. So I think this curriculum could be an invitation for people who can consent to and name that they have the capacity and the willingness to come back to this conversation and to keep uprooting the things that want to stop liberation from being possible. And so maybe it won't be for everybody, but I want to believe that for people who this is attractive, who find the idea of a liberating system that's beyond the system constructs of domination we have now, something so compelling for them that they will be ready and willing to join it. And it might not be everybody, but that's okay, right? It's okay to start with who's ready to do the work. So I would say, yeah, I would definitely go for it. And at least you know now from your last experience what maybe some of the pitfalls are, and maybe you bring that wisdom to this next round. Because if we as writers took our first round of trying this as the signal not to do, I mean, there would be no curriculum, because our first round our first round had its challenges, right? Much like what you summarized. So, and we had to deal with the fallout for a little while too, right? But if we let that be the thing that decided whether we did it or not, there would be no curriculum today. So I say start with who's ready and move at the speed of trust, Okay.
Thank you, Chantel. Does anyone else want to respond to that? We have not received any other questions. So if there are, Regina.
Yeah, I would just say amen to what Chantel just said, and remind people that we worked really hard on that section in the front of, ways to be, agreements. There are notes to facilitators all the way through. And so we really try to think about what it means to be a group of people that's trying to do this work and facilitators who are trying to shepherd people through the process. The word process keeps coming up in this conversation, and it does because it's important. It's an unfolding. Every group's experience is going to be different because you are coming from where you come from with the stories that you bring with you. And paying attention to good process and good facilitation will be worth its weight in gold for, and it's still not a promise of what your outcome is going to be, but the process of these things are so important, so important. So yeah, I would say, yeah, it's worth it.
Thank you, Regina. As we transition, is there any last thoughts or questions that you as panelists wanted to share out with the group?
So glad y'all are like feeling like this is a relevant conversation. I think Midnight Church USA for making this accessible for people. I think $20 is a steal. And like, if you can't find anybody else to do this with you, do it by yourself, and then convert other people or recruit other people to do it with you, maybe the second round or something. But I want to say it's made to be really accessible. I appreciate Midnight Church USA making it accessible for people. Yeah, and I'm grateful. I'm grateful for all of you, my co-writers. Like, thank you for being part of this process and allowing me to be part of it with you.
Thank you, Chantel. I'm dropping the link for the curriculum again in the chat for all of the attendees today. A reminder that Chantel did say it is $20, and we highly encourage you. Paying people for their emotional labor and their expertise is so important. So I'm just going to be bold and say that, and trust that, you know, the spirit is saying drop 100 in there, do that as well. There were some general questions as well. Is this curriculum is available outside of the Mennonite denomination? Yes, it is. Please go ahead and download that. Again, it is $20 for what the spirit is leading for you. Again, as we end today, I wanted to express gratefulness for this panel, for their time, for holding space with us, for their expertise, and for each of you that decided to join us tonight. I also want to share that next month, Women in Leadership with MCUSA is pushing out a survey to help us understand a little bit more how sexism is showing up in individual churches and at the denominational level. We will have more information about that at the beginning of June, I believe. So please do pay attention for that survey. Again, thank you for your time, and blessings to each of you as you journey. Have a wonderful rest of your evening.